September 3, 1914. Less than 6 weeks since the guns of August shattered Europe's peace, and the German army stands just 30 miles from Paris. Through field glasses, German cavalrymen can see the Eiffel Tower piercing the horizon. The French government has fled to Bordeaux, taking the gold reserves with them. Workers at the Louvre frantically crate masterpieces for evacuation to Toulouse. Tens of thousands of Parisians crowd railway stations, desperate to escape before the enemy arrives. German propaganda leaflets rain down from biplanes overhead, their message brutal in its simplicity. There is nothing you can do but surrender. For the generals commanding the exhausted French and British armies retreating before the German juggernaut, the situation appears hopeless. They have lost every major battle of the past month. Belgian fortresses fell like dominoes. French offensives shattered against German machine guns. The British Expeditionary Force barely escaped destruction at Mons. Now, after retreating more than 250 kilometers in less than 2 weeks, the Allied armies stand with their backs to Paris. One more defeat, one final German victory, and France will fall. The war will be over by Christmas, just as everyone predicted, but with Germany triumphant. Yet in the next 9 days, something extraordinary will happen. The seemingly inevitable German victory will transform into one of the most stunning reversals in military history. The French will call it Le Miracle de la Marne, the miracle of the Marne, and that miracle will save not just Paris, but quite possibly change the entire course of the 20th century. To understand how close Germany came to winning World War I in its opening weeks, you need to grasp the audacious brilliance of the Schlieffen Plan. Field Marshal Alfred von Schlieffen, chief of the German General Staff until 1906, faced an impossible strategic problem. Germany was surrounded. France to the west sought revenge for the humiliation of 1870 and the loss of Alsace-Lorraine. Russia to the east, with its inexhaustible population, was modernizing its army. The Franco-Russian alliance meant that any European war would force Germany to fight on 2 fronts simultaneously, a nightmare scenario that had haunted German military planners for decades. Orthodox military thinking suggested a defensive war, holding both fronts until enemies exhausted themselves. Schlieffen rejected this approach entirely. Defense meant a long war, and a long war meant Germany would be crushed between the 2 Allied powers. Instead, Schlieffen proposed something radical. Germany would exploit the fundamental difference between its 2 enemies: speed. The French army, connected by rail networks, could mobilize in 2 weeks. The vast Russian Empire, with its primitive infrastructure, would require 6 weeks or more to fully mobilize its forces. That difference created a window of opportunity. If Germany could defeat France in 6 weeks, before Russia mobilized, it could then transfer its entire army eastward by rail to face the Russians. The plan was breathtaking in its scope. Schlieffen envisioned a massive right wing, comprising 90% of German military strength, sweeping through Belgium and northern France in a giant wheeling movement. The right wing would be so powerful, so overwhelming, that it would simply brush aside all opposition. Meanwhile, a weak left wing would hold defensive positions along the Franco-German border, deliberately inviting French attacks that would pull French forces away from the decisive battle in the north. The massive German right wing would swing west of Paris, then pivot southeast to encircle the French armies against their own fortifications. Schlieffen imagined a modern Cana, the ancient Carthaginian victory, where Hannibal had enveloped and destroyed a much larger Roman army through perfect execution of the double envelopment. Paris would fall, the French army would be annihilated, and France would sue for peace within 6 weeks. Then Germany's armies would race eastward to deliver the same treatment to Russia. There were problems with the plan, of course. It required violating Belgian neutrality, which would likely bring Britain into the war. It demanded perfect timing and flawless execution, and it assumed the French would react exactly as predicted, fighting where Schlieffen wanted them to fight rather than where they might choose to engage. But German military tradition emphasized bold offensive action, and after Schlieffen's retirement, His successor Helmuth von Moltke the Younger retained the basic concept, while making modifications that would prove disastrous. When Germany declared war on France on August 3, 1914, and German troops crossed into Belgium the following day, the Schlieffen Plan went into action. 7 German armies, numbering more than 1.5 million men, began their advance. The Belgian fortress city of Liege stood directly in their path, and its ring of 12 modern forts should have stopped the German advance cold. Instead, Germany deployed its secret weapon, super-heavy siege howitzers, including the massive 420 mortars that journalists dubbed Big Bertha. These artillery pieces, the largest mobile guns ever built, systematically demolished the Belgian forts. The concrete and steel fortifications that were supposed to be impregnable simply disintegrated under shells weighing nearly a ton. By August 16, Liege had fallen, and the German armies poured through. The speed of the German advance shocked everyone. The German First Army under General Alexander von Kluck covered 25 miles per day, an exhausting pace for infantry carrying full equipment in August heat. Behind them stretched supply columns that couldn't keep up. German soldiers began to outrun their logistics, subsisting on commandeered food and whatever they could carry. But the momentum was intoxicating. Town after town fell. The small Belgian army retreated into the fortress of Antwerp. The British Expeditionary Force, just 100,000 men compared to Germany's millions, encountered von Kluck's First Army at Mons on August 23 and fought a desperate delaying action before retreating. To the south, French armies launched their own offensives as dictated by Plan XVII, France's pre-war strategy that emphasized offensive spirit above all else. French infantry, many still wearing their traditional dark blue coats and bright red trousers, advanced with bands playing and flags flying. They marched directly into German machine gun positions and modern artillery. The results were catastrophic. In a single day of fighting during the Battle of the Frontiers, French forces suffered 27,000 men killed. That's more casualties in one day than the British Army suffered during the entire first month of the war. French élan vital, the mystical fighting spirit that military theorists insisted would overcome any obstacle, proved no match for German planning and firepower. By late August, the strategic situation was clear. German armies were advancing on a front stretching from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border, but the crucial action was on the German right wing, where von Kluck's First Army and Karl von Bülow's Second Army were driving toward Paris. The French and British armies were in full retreat, what historians would call the Great Retreat, falling back toward Paris in hopes of establishing a defensive line somewhere, anywhere, before complete collapse. French Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre, a calm and methodical officer known for his unflappable demeanor and his insistence on eating 3 proper meals daily regardless of circumstances, faced the crisis of his career. Field Marshal Sir John French, commanding the British Expeditionary Force, had lost faith in the French and was planning to withdraw his forces to port cities on the English Channel for evacuation back to Britain. If the BEF pulled out, exposing the French flank, the war was lost. Paris prepared for siege. The government departed on September 2, leaving behind General Joseph Gallieni as military governor with orders to defend the capital to the last. Gallieni, aged 65 and brought out of retirement for this emergency, began preparing defenses, but he knew the truth. Paris had barely 500 modern artillery pieces and perhaps 80,000 garrison troops. If the full weight of the German army turned against the city, it would fall in days, perhaps hours. Then reconnaissance pilots spotted something unexpected. Von Kluck's First Army, which should have been wheeling west of Paris to envelop it from the north and west as Schlieffen had planned, was instead turning southeast, passing east of Paris. On September 3, French aviators confirmed it. The Germans were changing direction. Instead of encircling Paris, von Kluck was wheeling to pursue the retreating French Fifth Army. In doing so, he was exposing his right flank directly to Paris and opening a gap between his First Army and von Bülow's Second Army. Gallieni recognized the opportunity immediately. If French forces struck von Kluck's exposed flank, they could force him to turn and fight with his back to Paris, disrupting the entire German advance. But Gallieni commanded only the Paris garrison. He needed Joffre to commit to a counteroffensive with the main French armies. The problem was that those armies were exhausted, demoralized, and still retreating. Asking them to turn and attack seemed to court disaster. Yet Joffre, demonstrating the calm judgment that was his greatest strength, made the decision. On September 4, he issued orders for a general counteroffensive beginning September 6. The French Sixth Army under General Michel-Joseph Marne, positioned north of Paris, would strike the German right flank. The British Expeditionary Force, convinced by Joffre with help from British War Minister Lord Kitchener, would advance into the gap between the German First and Second Armies. The French Fifth Army under newly appointed General Louis Franchet d'Esperey, who had replaced the overly cautious General Lanrezac, would attack von Bülow's Second Army. It was an all-or-nothing gamble. If the counteroffensive failed, the French armies would be destroyed and Paris would fall within days. September 5, 1914. Before dawn, Gallieni acted on his own initiative, ordering Marne's Sixth Army to begin its attack a day early. Some 150,000 French troops surged northeast from Paris, striking the flank of von Kluck's First Army near the Arc River. Von Kluck, supremely confident after weeks of victory, initially dismissed the attack as a minor nuisance. But as the day progressed and French pressure intensified, he realized this was a major offensive. He faced a terrible choice: continue pursuing the French Fifth Army to his southeast, or wheel his entire army to face this new threat from Paris. Von Kluck chose to protect his flank. He ordered his forces to turn and engage Marne's Sixth Army, pulling units from his southernmost positions to reinforce his right wing. That movement, tactically sensible in isolation, had enormous strategic consequences. As von Kluck's First Army wheeled to face Paris, the gap between it and von Bülow's Second Army widened from a narrow seam to a gaping 30-mile chasm. Now comes one of the most famous episodes of World War I, the Taxis of the Marne. On the night of September 6, with Marne's Sixth Army under severe pressure and desperately needing reinforcements, Gallieni requisitioned every taxi cab in Paris. The story as it entered legend tells of 600 to 1,300 Parisian taxis, mostly Renault AG1 landaulettes, being commandeered by police who pulled passengers out mid-ride and directed drivers to less invalids. From there, the taxis puttered northeast at their maximum speed of 25 miles per hour, each carrying 5 soldiers plus equipment, ferrying approximately 6,000 troops of the 7th Infantry Division to the front. The image is powerful. Civilian taxi drivers, men too old for military service, becoming heroes by rushing reinforcements to save Paris in its darkest hour. It speaks to unity, sacrifice, and the French national spirit in crisis. But like many wartime legends, the truth is more complicated and less decisive. Yes, the taxis really did transport troops to the front. Yes, it was an extraordinary logistical improvisation. But 6,000 soldiers represented a tiny fraction of the more than 1 million Allied troops engaged in the Battle of the Marne. Most of the taxi-transported troops were held in reserve and never saw combat during the critical phase of the battle. Trains and requisition trucks moved far more soldiers. The taxis made excellent propaganda, a story that boosted French morale at a critical moment by demonstrating that even civilians were contributing to national defense. The myth of the taxis helped save Paris, but the taxis themselves did not. What actually saved Paris was a German mistake and French determination to exploit it. September 6 through 9, 1914. Fighting raged across a front extending more than 100 miles, from the Arc River northwest of Paris to the marshes of Saint-Gond in the east. More than 2.5 million men were locked in combat across farmland, forests, and small villages that would become names written in blood. On the German right, von Kluck's First Army hammered Monnery's Sixth Army in brutal fighting along the Arc. French forces gave ground slowly, contesting every village and every bridge. The battle here was attritional, each side feeding in reinforcements to maintain the line, neither able to achieve a breakthrough. What mattered was that von Kluck was fixed in place, unable to continue his advance, his attention riveted on the threat to his flank rather than the strategic objective of Paris. In the center, the British Expeditionary Force and the French Fifth Army advanced cautiously into the gap between the German First and Second Armies. The BEF, having retreated for 2 weeks straight, found the sudden advance disorienting. Officers expected to encounter German defenses at any moment. Instead, their scouts reported empty roads and abandoned positions. By September 8, British troops were crossing the Marne River itself, the natural barrier that should have been heavily defended. They found German rear guard units, logistics columns, and in some cases German soldiers so drunk from looting wine cellars that they could be captured without resistance. The once formidable German advance was coming apart at the seams. Von Bülow's Second Army, seeing British and French forces advancing into the gap on his right and under direct attack from D'Esperey's Fifth Army on his front, faced potential encirclement. He appealed desperately to von Kluck for support, but von Kluck had his own crisis managing the French Sixth Army. At German headquarters far from the front, Chief of Staff Helmuth von Moltke experienced a breakdown. He had modified Schlieffen's plan, weakening the right wing by withdrawing divisions to reinforce other sectors. Now the right wing, the hammer that was supposed to crush France, was being pushed back. Communication from the front was fragmentary and contradictory. Von Moltke, plagued by doubts and receiving incomplete information, sent Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hensch to assess the situation and coordinate the German armies. Hensch arrived at von Bülow's headquarters on September 9 to find the Second Army commander advocating retreat to avoid encirclement. Hensch, exceeding his authority but acting on what he believed were von Moltke's intentions, authorized the withdrawal. Von Bülow ordered his Second Army to retreat to the Aisne River. When von Kluck learned that the Second Army was withdrawing, exposing his left flank, he had no choice but to order his own First Army to fall back as well. The German retreat began on September 9 and continued for several days. It was not a rout. German discipline held, and rear guard actions fought skillfully delayed Allied pursuit, but it was unquestionably a retreat, the first German withdrawal of the war. The seemingly unstoppable German advance that had swept across Belgium and northern France in just 5 weeks had been stopped and thrown back. By September 12, German forces had established new defensive positions along the Aisne River, roughly 40 to 50 miles north of where they had stood when the battle began. They dug trenches and prepared fortifications. The Battle of the Marne was over. Paris was saved. The war would continue. The human cost of the miracle was staggering. Casualty figures vary by source, but historians generally accept that French forces suffered approximately 250,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. The British Expeditionary Force lost another 13,000 men. German losses totaled roughly 250,000 to 300,000. More than 500,000 men killed or wounded in 7 days of fighting. Some units suffered catastrophic losses. Individual battalions that had marched into battle 800 strong emerged with 200 survivors. Officers died at even higher rates than enlisted men as they led attacks into machine gun fire. Field hospitals overflowed with wounded. The roads back from the front were clogged with ambulances and walking wounded, a preview of the industrial-scale casualties that would characterize the entire war. The strategic consequences extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. Most obviously, France had not been defeated in 6 weeks. The Schlieffen Plan, the blueprint for German victory, had failed. Germany now faced exactly what it had sought to avoid: a two-front war against France and Britain in the west and Russia in the east. Russia had mobilized faster than expected and had already invaded East Prussia, requiring Germany to divert forces eastward. The window of opportunity had closed. There would be no quick victory, no triumphal entry into Paris, no negotiated peace with France eliminated from the war. September 1914 shattered the illusion that this would be a short war. When German forces established their positions along the Aisne River after the Marne, they dug trenches. Initially, these were intended as temporary field fortifications, positions to hold for a few days or weeks before mobile warfare resumed. But weeks turned to months. Both sides attempted flanking maneuvers in what became known as the Race to the Sea, each trying to outflank the other northward toward the English Channel. Every flanking attempt was met by a countermove. Trenches multiplied, spreading north toward Belgium. By December 1914, the Western Front stretched in an unbroken line of trenches, barbed wire, and fortifications from the North Sea to the Swiss border, a distance of more than 400 miles. That line would barely move for the next 3.5 years. The Battle of the Marne had not just saved Paris, it had transformed World War I from a war of movement into a war of attrition. The next major offensives, at Verdun and the Somme, would measure success not in miles gained but in yards, purchased with hundreds of thousands of casualties. Why did Germany come so close yet ultimately fail? Historians have debated this question for more than a century. Von Moltke's modifications to the Schlieffen Plan certainly played a role. By weakening the right wing and refusing to strip the left wing to reinforce the main advance, he denied the offensive the overwhelming power Schlieffen had deemed essential. Schlieffen's dying words, possibly apocryphal, were supposedly, "Keep the right wing strong." Von Moltke did not. Logistics played a crucial part as well. German armies advanced faster than their supply lines could follow. Soldiers were exhausted, having marched hundreds of miles in August heat while fighting continuous rear guard actions. Horses, essential for moving artillery and supplies, were worked to death. Many German units were on half rations by the time they reached the Marne, subsisting on whatever they could requisition from French civilians. Exhausted, hungry, and outrunning their ammunition supplies, the German forces that reached the Marne in early September were shadows of the powerful armies that had invaded Belgium a month earlier. German command and control problems proved critical. Von Moltke established his headquarters hundreds of miles behind the front in Luxembourg. In an age before radio, he depended on telegraph and telephone lines that were constantly being cut, and on couriers who required hours or days to deliver messages. He had only the vaguest idea what was happening at the front. Individual army commanders made decisions based on their local situations, without understanding the strategic picture. Von Kluck's decision to wheel southeast instead of west of Paris made tactical sense from his perspective, pursuing what appeared to be a defeated enemy. But strategically, it violated the fundamental premise of the Schlieffen Plan and created the gap that proved fatal. Yet perhaps the most important factor was that the French and British soldiers, despite losing battle after battle in August, never broke completely. They retreated, but in relatively good order. They maintained unit cohesion and morale despite catastrophic losses. French officers ruthlessly purged commanders they deemed lacking in offensive spirit, replacing them with more aggressive leaders. Joffre's calm leadership prevented panic and maintained army discipline even during the darkest days of the retreat. When the order came to turn and counterattack, exhausted French soldiers obeyed. The miracle of the Marne was not that taxis rushed troops to the front, though that makes for a better story. The miracle was that beaten armies found the strength to turn and fight, that exhausted soldiers discovered reserves of courage they didn't know they possessed, and that French and British commanders, despite weeks of failure, managed to coordinate a counteroffensive that exploited a fleeting German vulnerability. The Germans had come within sight of Paris. They had defeated the French in nearly every major engagement of August 1914. Victory had seemed inevitable. But in war, nothing is truly inevitable. A few decisions made differently, a reconnaissance report acted upon, a general more willing to take risks or less willing to retreat. Any of these might have changed everything. The Battle of the Marne represents one of history's great turning points, a moment when the course of the 20th century pivoted on decisions made by exhausted commanders operating with incomplete information under impossible pressure. If Paris had fallen, if France had been forced to surrender in September 1914, the world would look unimaginably different. No prolonged Western Front. No American entry into a war that would have already been decided. No Russian Revolution, since Russia might well have made a separate peace after France's defeat. No redrawing of European borders after the war. No Treaty of Versailles with its punitive terms that would poison European politics for the next 2 decades. The Battle of the Marne did not end World War I. It ensured the war would continue, transforming it into the grinding, attritional nightmare that would ultimately cost more than 17 million lives. Whether that makes the miracle of the Marne a blessing or a curse depends on your perspective. What's undeniable is that, in September 1914, France and Britain stared defeat in the face and somehow found a way to turn impending disaster into survival. That, more than any legend about taxis or individual acts of heroism, is the true miracle of the Marne. If this deep dive into one of World War I's most decisive battles captured your interest, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more comprehensive explorations of the Great War. We're committed to telling these stories with the depth and detail they deserve, going beyond the myths to understand what really happened and why it mattered. What other pivotal moments from World War I should we explore? Let us know in the comments. Until next time, remember that history's turning points often come down to decisions made by ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances.